Well, I'm here today with a very special discussion in store. This is something that we have been following on our program, our radio program, A Neighbor's Choice, and now we have the opportunity to have a deep dive discussion with Dr. Bruce Hammock and Dr. Bruce German, who are both at UC Davis and have been doing research on linoleic acid, which is a component of what people know as omega-6 or seed oils that people eat, and how that affects our health. So I was, my initial interest was piqued because of this paper that a listener on my radio show sent me, Leonardo. Well, I'll give him a shout out here. He knows, and Frontiers in Physiology, they published a new paper, Plasma Linoleic. And if I'm saying these words wrong, just forgive me, but linoleic diols are potential biomarkers for severe COVID-19 infections. And there's this connection that's observed in the paper between potentially stored up consumption of linoleic acid and severe COVID cases. So we want to get into that. So thanks for joining me.
You're very welcome.
So, yes. Professor Hammock, how did you come about to, the paper was looking at the presence of leukotoxin diol, which is a highly toxic product, apparently of the normal immune response in COVID-19 patients. How did you become interested in this topic?
It's a very long story, but in the Army, I worked at a burn center in Texas at Fort Sam. And it's a depressing place to work during the Vietnam period because we burned a lot of people. And to credit of Fort Sam, they would treat anybody who got there who had severe burns. But the outcomes were never very good. People were in terrible pain. That was very difficult to treat. But every now and then you would have somebody who you thought would get well. And then they get a cough, and then they get a little temperature. The next day they'd be really sick, and then they die. And it's often called sepsis, or sometimes with the lungs, ARDS. It's also called multi-organ failure. So it often happens after very severe trauma. And we're seeing that in, it accounts for maybe 40% of the mortality with COVID-19. So I've been following this, and in the literatures in the 70s, a group in Japan found that epoxides of linoleic acid were associated with death in burn patients. So we began to follow this and found it was surprisingly not the epoxides, which they had called leukotoxins, but in fact the product diols. And we'd been studying epoxides of arachidonic acid and the omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, and the epoxides are strongly anti-inflammatory. They help resolve inflammation. And surprisingly, the diols of linoleic do just the opposite. Now, linoleic is an essential fatty acid. We need it for the vapor barrier so that our skins don't leak water. So we have to have it. But as Bruce will explain, evolutionarily, there wasn't very much in our diet. So we learned how to concentrate it in our diet. But now, after the Korean
War,
the
production of vegetable oils.
Yeah, we had the high production primarily. And the idea that because stearic acid was in the arterial plaques of kids killed during the Korean War, that the fact that way too much stearic acid is bad was translated somehow into lots of linoleic acid is good.
Okay.
So I think we're having a problem in that linoleic acid is also used as a signaling molecule as well as a nutrient, but it's used as a signaling molecule at very, very low levels. And now we have it at high levels. So we have, I think, a pathway explaining how in our biochemical attempts to resolve our inflammation, to make it better after we've attacked the virus, we accidentally, in a sense, make the linoleic diols or the leukotoxin diols, which cause very profound vascular permeability. Our blood vessels leak and our lungs fill with liquid.
Now,
so this is up there.
very interesting. Academically, you're an entomologist by training. Is that correct?
It's sort of a misnomer that I'm a toxicologist, and I'm so old that there was no toxicology. So I started out studying pesticides, and yes, I have a background in entomology, but we're more working in pharmacology and nutrition now.
Interesting, interesting. And
so it helps to have given our standard American diet, it helps to have a background in toxicology when you're studying nutrition, right?
Sadly, that seems to be the case. And Professor German, if you could give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. I'm a food chemist, and my original expertise is in dietary fats. So yes, we've been studying all of the basic fatty acids. I'm in Bruce's generation, so we have over a century of experience in this field.
Between the two of you.
Between the two of us.
Excellent. Now you wrote a paper, a very interesting paper that I came across several years ago, in which you used crocodile oil. You fed it to rodents to alter the fatty acid composition of the diet. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And where on earth does one find crocodile oil?
Well, we've been through several periods in the scientific history of dietary fats. And one of the periods was the idea that omega-3 fatty acids are uniquely therapeutic. So we were looking at various sources. It turns out that omega-3 fatty acids originate in plants and marine algae. And so they concentrate in animal tissues because those animals and fish eat them. But there was this idea that certain kinds of reptilian oils were unusually therapeutic. It turns out they weren't, which is probably good news, because crocodiles are not enthusiastic about parting with their fats.
No, I would imagine pressing a crocodile for the oil has got to be an interesting experience.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to actually get a well-fed crocodile too.
Right. And what were you using this crocodile oil for? You were trying to alter the fatty acid composition of.
Well, it goes to the principle that Bruce has laid out. Is in most respects we regulate the composition of our lipids in our bodies ourselves. So we don't turn into fish when we eat fish. We don't turn into crocodiles when we eat crocodiles. But for some of the fatty acids, there is an unusual replacement. And the omega-6 and omega-3 are competitive. And so if your diet is rich in omega-6, you tend to accumulate those fatty acids in your body lipids. If you tend to accumulate omega-3s, you tend to, in essence, reflect that. And then the question becomes, does it matter? And again, we have suffered scientifically with the problem that we've looked at health from a very narrow focus. Actually, mostly the diseases of middle-aged rich white men, which means we study heart disease. And right. We don't study heart disease itself even holistically. We studied for many decades cholesterol. What can lower cholesterol? And omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids in the diets of humans and animals will lower cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. That was one of the reasons why agriculturally farmers switched, processors converted, formulators adopted omega-6 as the go-to edible oil in the diet because it looked like it would help heart disease. Unfortunately, we're looking at heart disease so narrowly, we didn't appreciate that there were other consequences of taking virtually every step in the agriculture and food chain and increasing linoleic acid. And now we're beginning to realize, just like Paracelsus did 500 years ago, dose matters. From a toxicological perspective, the dose makes the poison. So linoleic acid is an essential fatty acid at about 0.2% of the diet, a tiny amount to have its role in helping your skin form, etc. But we eat much more than 10 times that now.
We eat much more than 10 times that, right? Is that what you?
Oh yeah,
Wow.
much more. So we have through agriculture, industrial practices, fantastically concentrated linoleic acid in our diet. And we're only beginning to realize, and Bruce's work has been absolutely central to this. These are signaling molecules, and whispering to someone is very different than screaming in the rear. And that's
right. And in the case of leukotoxin specifically, it's much more than a signaling molecule. It appears to be an immune defense. It appears to be converted into something that's used in the oxidative burst that white blood cells use to defend the body against infection. Is that correct?
This was the hypothesis in the 70s in Japan. Whether this holds true or not, we don't know. It certainly, their evidence is correlative. But it turned out that one of the complications of our field, Tucker, is that leukotoxins, linoleic epoxides have many names. And under the name of chemokine, lipokine, bradykine, I envisioned that full of kinds. But bradykines seem to shift our brown fat to white fat ratios at very low levels. And these are, in a sense, in a somewhat chubby American, these are probably good things, that they're shifting our ability to burn fat and keep warm during the winter. But these are working at levels that are 1,000 times lower than the amounts we're consuming now.
Wow.
So our bodies have used the linoleic not only as a source of nutrition to burn,
right,
but as chemical mediators. At very low concentrations, they control the vascular permeability, the leakiness of our blood vessels. We want our blood vessels to be leaky to get food out, but not too leaky. So when we increase our linoleic intake, massive amounts, and then when we get terribly stressed, so this can be a broken femur from a car wreck, it could be COVID or another disease. We make large amounts of epoxides of fatty acids, which help resolve inflammation. But with so much linoleic around, we also make these linoleic epoxides and diols, which turn out to be pretty toxic at very high levels, even though very beneficial at very low levels.
Right. So leukotoxin under the normal circumstances is involved in the browning of white fat tissue, which it's thought helps one to burn calories and stay warm and is, a beneficial process. But
can you explain that a little bit more, the browning of white fat for our general audience? What would that?
Well, for a long time, we thought that all fat was the same. Fat's a very active tissue. It's a storage location to get us through the long winter fast. But it's also a very active tissue. So if we get warm, we undergo something called thermogenesis, where we burn carbohydrate and particularly fat to warm us up. And the shivering response would be like that. So the so-called brown fat, which is more heavily vascularized, is highly involved in this, while the white fat, although active as well, seems to be more of a storage tissue.
Interesting.
Right. So it has a perfectly normal function in the body at the right level, and it's not. I mean, I think it's important, as Professor German said, the dose makes the poison. A lot of these things, like my favorite example is too much water will kill you, but that doesn't mean that water is inherently a bad thing. Obviously, we all need to drink water.
And I think it's the same, Tucker, with linoleic. It's a good thing. It's just too much of a good thing. And actually,
now,
go ahead.
One of the papers I came across in researching this myself described, it was Burston et al. From 1996, and they talked about the ratio of C18 unsaturated fatty acids, specifically linoleic, to the development and survival of ARDS in at-risk patients. And they said an increase in serum C18 unsaturated fatty acids as a predictor of the development of acute respiratory distress syndrome. And just a little background, ARDS is acute respiratory distress syndrome, which appears to be, as you said, about 40% of the time what people die from in COVID-19. So this sounds like the more of this fat you have in your body, the more susceptible you are to developing ARDS.
That was a really
You're
nice
both nodding.
correlation that they made.
Yes. And the content per Professor German's experiments with the crocodile oil in the body depends to some extent on what you're consuming in the diet, obviously, is the point that you've both been making. Very
We're
interesting.
using fats, Tucker, of course, for nutrition. So they are very, very important to get us over the winter hungry period when we were evolving. But we're also using some of them as regulatory molecules. So arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6 fat, can go through several pathways. One series of pathways are inflammation, and it's used to turn on our inflammatory burst if we get an infection with a virus or a bacterium, or if we get a broken leg. But other branch of the so-called arachidonic cascade is anti-inflammatory or inflammation resolving. So inflammation is a good thing to attack our pathogens, but it's so critical that we attack the pathogens quickly. The tools that we use in our bodies can kill us. And so it's very critical that we resolve that inflammation. And so other branches of the arachidonic cascade, which use both arachidonic acid and the omega-3 fats, serve to resolve inflammation and turn us back to normal. And what often happens with severe injury or infection is that this pathway gets fouled up. We don't resolve that inflammation, and that then leads to sepsis, and ARDS is part of sepsis.
Right. Now, you had said you did a great, by the way, interview in the American Entomologist, and you said, I found this quite striking, 75% by weight of the drugs sold in the world work on a single pathway called the arachidonic cascade, where arachidonic acid, which is another omega-6 fat for the audience, is converted by cyclooxygenase into prostaglandins, which are strongly pro-inflammatory. So could you explain a little bit about the arachidonic cascade? You just touched on it. What drugs are used to treat it, and what import does that have for human health?
An awful lot. Some of our absolute best drugs in the world work on the arachidonic cascade, and we're all familiar with them. So aspirin, ibuprofen, Advil, Celebrex, Vioxx, all work to block this inflammatory pathway where arachidonic acid goes to prostaglandins and thromboxanes. So this is very critical to us because it turns on an immune response that fights off viruses, bacteria, and other things. Mm-hmm. It also enhances pain, and pain also is a good thing as long as we don't have too much of it. It says, take your finger off the hot plate.
Of course, right.
But if that pain becomes chronic rather than warning, it's terribly debilitating. So inflammation and pain are enhanced by the cyclooxygenase pathway of the arachidonic acid cascade. It's also enhanced by the lipoxygenase pathway. So asthma, where we use Singular, for example, block these two very important inflammatory pathways that act in an emergency to keep us healthy. But it turns out that there's another branch of the cascade that's only recently been appreciated. It's now called the P450 branch of the cascade, where we make things called epoxides of arachidonic acid and then the omega-3 fatty acids. And these are strongly anti-inflammatory, they're strongly analgesic, and they're pro-resolving. They move the inflammatory state back towards normal. So from a drug standpoint, we're trying to make these compounds or mimics of these compounds that will help resolve inflammation therapeutically. From a nutritional standpoint, that suggests that maybe if we were to increase our omega-3 fatty acid intake combined with decreasing our omega-6 fatty acid intake, we might move ourselves a little further away from a state of pain and a state of inflammation back towards normal.
Okay, and that, boy, that was a very loaded.
Very opinionated.
No, very, not only very opinionated, but you brought up a lot of really loaded topics there. I personally got into this topic through my own health experiences, and the first intervention that I did was trying to reduce my omega-6 intake. And one of the first things that I noticed was a dramatic shift in inflammation and pain response to injury. And it was so notable that when it first started happening, I became worried that I might be experiencing leprosy, because I would get these, which, you know, for the audience, one of the main symptom of leprosy is that you lose your feeling in your periphery. So lepers tend to they lose fingers because they get cuts and they get infections and they can't feel what's going on. So I was, you know, falling and getting injured and not noticing it, and, you know, which is a good thing, but a little alarming because it was such a dramatic difference from my previous experience. So I can personally speak to the effect that diet seems to have on these pathways.
Now explains why those older generations from previous centuries were so tougher than us, because they literally didn't have as much omega-6 in their bodies, huh?
Well, exactly. You read these old historical accounts of, you know, the Romans fighting each other and hacking themselves up with swords, and they keep going. I mean, it's amazing. Whereas, you know, we get a hangnail and we're debilitated and reaching for the series of drugs that Professor Hammock was just describing. Okay, so the cascade that you're talking about, part of it, particularly in the case of leukotoxin, goes through something called the soluble epoxy hydrolase, which I understand that you were the discoverer of. Is that correct?
Koji Gell and I founded as graduate students longer ago than I'd like to think. So we were back then asking how caterpillars turn into butterflies. We found this enzyme that was important, and for no particular reason asked, does it occur in fish and mice and humans and cows? And it does. And so it's involved in this anti-inflammatory branch of the arachidonic cascade. So
but that's also what converts leukotoxin into the leukotoxin diol.
Correct. So when we get inflamed, the soluble epoxide hydrolase goes way up. So it's a marker of inflammation. But if we have high levels of leukotoxin, it's also a cause of inflammation. So we've got, I think, a very fine-tuned biochemical system, and we've sort of thrown the monkey wrench into it by eating too much of a good thing with linoleic.
Right. So now you've been working on a pharmacological intervention to control the level of SEH.
Yes.
And you've been working with horses with tendinitis. Can you tell us a little bit about that line of research of yours? So
we actually have the compound in human clinical trials, very early safety trials. And so far, by FDA standards, the compound is looking very safe. Now, whether it's efficacious in man remains to be seen. But by inhibiting the soluble epoxide hydrolase, we preserve epoxides of arachidonate and EPA and DHA, which are strongly pro-resolving. They are analgesic, they reduce blood pressure, and they reduce pain. So the compounds seem to move us back from an inflamed, painful state to a more normal state. Other people are making chemical mimics of EPA, DHA epoxides. So this is the resolving branch of the arachidonic cascade that we're trying to preserve, while aspirin, ibuprofen would be blocking the pro-inflammatory and the painful branch of the arachidonic cascade. So from a therapeutic standpoint, we're trying to move these compounds into the clinic and It's a long path because we want to make sure everything's safe. So we've been supported by NIH for the last 10 years to do this. As far as the horses, we worked on it for a couple of reasons. One is that a very difficult problem to treat is called neuropathic pain, nerve injury pain. So we see this in some athletes where you have spinal cord compression. Horses in particular get a disease called laminitis. It's not well known except in the equine field, where most Triple Crown winners ultimately have died of laminitis. So the
but they don't die of it. They're put down because of it, correct?
Ultimately they would die of it, but they're normally put down.
Right, I see.
So horses walk on their finger, and your fingernail is their hoof, and this joint is long, it's greatly extended, and the horse hoof is this wonderful device where if you've watched a horse, they seem like they're bouncing on their hooves, and they are, because the hoof is compressing this bone, and it makes the horse pop out. But now we've got a bone in this long tendon sheath, and if it gets inflamed, it's terrible. And it's rare that horses get over severe laminitis.
Unless.
I'm sorry?
I said unless, because you've apparently been able to help them get over it.
So we've been really successful. And our first horse, Hula Halala, Alonzo Guedes in the vet school, and I got a call, and they were going to put her down. She failed every known drug for laminitis at the UC Davis vet school. So we got a reprieve and gave her the EH inhibitors, and she was back on her feet in a few days and eating, and she's still 3 years later teaching kids how to ride. So
that's remarkable.
So we've done this for quite a few horses, and in parallel, we're trying to move this drug forward to treat both equine arthritis and then canine feline arthritis, but also the neuropathic pain condition in horses, laminitis. And the clinical trials that will start in June and July will be on diabetic neuropathic pain, where the nerves, particularly in the feet, have something called endoplasmic reticulum stress from high blood sugar in diabetics. So it's a very intractable pain problem.
Mm-hmm. Is that diabetic pain problem caused by too much omega-6 too, possibly?
In the literature, there quite good data, including from us and others, that increasing the omega-3, if you decrease the omega-6, will help resolve, not cure, but help reduce the diabetic pain.
And neuropathy,
peripheral
neuropathy, right?
This is diabetic peripheral neuropathy. And Bill Lanz, who is one of the real scientific pioneers in the omega-3s, really pushes that it's very important to reduce omega-6 as we increase omega-3. Because like every American, I'd like to take a pill, and I don't like to stop eating my ice cream.
Well, ice cream doesn't have much omega-6 typically, at least not if it's made traditionally.
But we do need to do both to reduce the omega-6 at the same time that we increase omega-3.
Now, some researchers, I believe it's Christopher Ramsden, showed that reducing omega-6 by itself increases the availability of omega-3 in the body. So it seems to be, that's really the starting point. I know in age-related macular degeneration, that's one of the few areas in medicine where they seem to recognize that this pathway is causal for that condition, which leads to blindness. And it's therefore obviously something we would all very much like to avoid. Now, another little bit of background for the audience on the chronic pain topic that you're discussing. It's my understanding that these conditions are what have led us in large part to the opioid epidemic that we're undergoing, is that people have this intractable pain condition, and the opioids, if they don't actually resolve the pain, they make people forget that they're having the pain. So it's a beneficial therapy, although of course it leads to all sorts of negative consequences. So this is really a fundamental treatment you're looking at.
Yes, we're actually funded by the National Institutes of Drug Abuse to try to find alternatives to opiate analgesics. So that's one of the financial and scientific drivers of what we're doing.
Dr. German, what is the best source that you guys have found to increase your omega-3 without increasing omega-6? So you're reducing your omega-6.
Crocodile oil, of course.
Actually, there are a variety of ways. Traditionally, of course, eating fish that come from an algal food chain. They are eating omega-3s, concentrating omega-3s. So cold water, fast swimming marine fish are the highest source. But to the point that Bruce made about competition, if you don't lower the amount of linoleic acid in your diet, then it's almost impossible to eat enough fish to compensate.
Right,
it's a competition.
Which is what we see in Japan, where they of course eat more fish than most places, and yet still seem to suffer from some of these things that are sought to be from excess linoleic acid. I mean, the term excess linoleic acid syndrome was first coined in Japan.
Yes,
my knowledge.
Yeah, and so that you really have to take your diet as an ensemble. Because of the influence of the success of essential nutrient vitamins and minerals and the therapeutic success of drugs, we tend to take a focused look at our diet. What's the one food that is causing us problems? With the one food that will provide a solution? And diet really should be looked at as an ensemble, and look at everything you're eating and evaluate the diet for its composition of linoleic acid and its composition of omega-3. If you do that, it turns out you can start dramatically lowering linoleic acid content, increasing omega-3 and achieving that. So, unfortunately, it's right now not easy, and I'm sure, Tucker, you can attest, lowering linoleic acid in your diet is not easy to do.
Requires a great deal of diligence.
Yeah, because we're
Our
not.
whole society is set up to feed us linoleic acid. And then in addition, Chris and Amir Taha, who wasn't able to join us today, are
Christopher Ramsden, you mean by Chris? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. And Amir and Chris are studying how we shift these fatty acids in our bodies. And we really evolved to concentrate linoleic acid against a huge gradient. So we evolved eating a lot of omega-3 and really having a hard time finding enough omega-6 to keep us healthy. So we've got hundreds of millions of years of evolution to concentrate linoleic. And now artificially, we've increased our linoleic consumption dramatically. So we're really having to fight uphill in a way to rebalance our fatty acids.
So I take it both of you guys have intentionally reduced and avoided vegetable oils since doing your research in this field, right?
It's hard to actually avoid, but I am experimenting with ghee and a few things.
Yeah.
Well, Fred Kumaro, who was the researcher who convinced the world to give up synthetic trans fats, wrote an account of his diet when he was 100 years old, and reducing vegetable oil consumption was one of his key points in that discussion. Now, two quick points. You'd mentioned consuming fish. I've come across some papers that suggest that getting omega-3 fats in the form of phospholipids can be beneficial rather than the triglyceride form that we usually find in fish oil. Professor German, have you looked into that, or do you have any thoughts on the benefits of fish versus fish oil in helping to resolve this shortage?
Well, it is discouragingly both complicated and not very well researched. There are indications that phospholipids provide an unusually bioavailable form, and this dietary form seems to improve certain aspects, suggesting that if we actually studied it, we would be able to, in essence, construct diets that could be very targeted to specific health outcomes. But to say the science this is not the way we look at diet. What we need to move is to what was moving forward now, precision nutrition, where we take everyone at their life stage and lifestyle and their health aspirations and start guiding them as an integrated solution towards the health destinations they want. And it sounds elaborate, but let's face it, that's what Google Maps is, right? I mean,
Right.
Where am I now? Where would I like to be? How do I get there? And Google Maps tells me. Why do we not have the same thing for diet? What's my health status now? What would I like it to be? What diet will get me there? And oh, by the way, just like Google Maps allows you to go on a scenic route, fast route, a more appropriate precision nutrition system would also know what you find delicious. So you'd get a healthy diet and it would be delicious.
Well, but we're somewhat, I mean, and yet our dietary guidelines are advising us to avoid some traditional fats like saturated animal fats and to focus our consumption on these vegetable oils.
Yeah, it takes a long time if you take a guideline for a population approach to move towards a more precise and personal recommendation. That's happening. Public policy is moving in the direction of a more precise and personal approach, but it's a very different model. We used to get where we wanted to go with foldable maps.
Right.
And you remember those road trips, which usually ended in divorce. Whereas now, my car tells me turn right, turn left, and soon it will all be autonomous.
And
So,
none of the
right.
maps should tell us to turn towards seed oils, right? We can agree on that, right?
Well, but I think it's also important to note that a lot of the research into, say, omega-3 fats has been relatively recent. I mean, it's recognized as being very important now, but that hasn't really been reflected in the guidelines, to Professor German's point.
Exactly right.
There is no recommendation for long-chain omega-3 fat consumption, even though in science and in medicine, even they're coming along to realize how crucial it is at many stages of life.
And exactly to that point, Bruce has only recently discovered all of the implications of this on biochemical pathways. I mean, that's why we do science. We make discoveries, and Bruce is illuminating this whole dimension of diet and health that just simply wasn't available 10 years ago.
In what year did you discover the soluble epoxide hydrolase enzyme?
It was 1979.
1979. So by the standards of science, that wasn't all that long ago, although I'm sure it seems like quite a long time for you.
A fun time. But you know, we also have to move in a sense of a whole concept and a whole industry. The plant oils are wonderful. They are feeding the world.
Right.
Both with the protein, say peanut cake that's left over. The world is facing a huge protein shortage, as well as an energy shortage. And the vegetable oils and vegetable protein are wonderful sources. And also with the omega-3s, I tend to be a Bill Land supporter and a believer that omega-3 increase in our diet can be healthy. But we've been a long time making or acquiring quality omega-3 oils. If omega-3 oils go rancid very, very quickly, the supply chain issues are not at all trivial. and rancid omega-3s can be out and out toxic. So it's a whole society, in a sense, working together to try to design a better diet and deliver that diet. We're lucky in this country in that we are faced with the problems of the wealthy and excess in general. But in much of the world, simply getting enough carbohydrate, enough protein, enough lipid is a real challenge. So the vegetable oil producers are really keeping the world fed.
So would it be possible to feed, I mean, this is just a hypothetical, but could the world sustain itself if vegetable oils didn't exist? I mean, obviously you can't just turn them off overnight.
Say if they went away tomorrow, I think we'd have a bit of a problem.
We'd have a problem.
But I'm just saying, I know if there's an abrupt change, but is it possible to feed the population of the world as it is now in a world in which people could go to more traditional fat sources for their fuel?
I would really question it. It would be a huge technological change to do so. That fruits and to some degree vegetables are very expensive foods. But in general, rice, beans, peanuts are very good at converting the sun's energy into nutrition. And in general, animal sources are not that good. They're very expensive in terms of how much energy impinges the earth from the sun that actually is converted into nutrition to feed people.
Yeah, and the marine fish is an example.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be harvesting the world's wild marine fish for nourishment of omega-3s. We're destroying the ecosystems of our marine environments for omega-3s. There are much better ways to get omega-3s from plant sources.
It sounded easy. We have several friends that have worked on this their whole career and pointed out that if we just engineer a plant to make omega-3, the plant will burn up. And when companies did, yes, omega-3s will explode. They are chemically reactive compounds.
Which is why when you I know that's a problem when you're redoing furniture. If you put linseed oil on a rag and leave it out in the sun, it'll burst into flames and it can cause fires.
That's Linoleic, among other things, and vernoliate, which is vernoliate is another name for leukotoxin. So we have plenty of names for that. So that was actually grown in order for you to have a nice finish on your furniture. But now some very, very clever people around the world have figured out ways to make plant oils that are high omega-3, low omega-6, and keep them stable and not oxidize. And I think we're going to start seeing these really moving into the human food chain, both as fish foods and then later as actual dietary components. So it's not been as easy as the genetic engineers thought 15 or 20 years ago.
Is it ever?
It is, yeah. But some very clever people are doing this, and I think it's commercial in Australia.
So without this engineered high omega-3, low omega-6 oil from plant sources, it would be impossible probably to feed the world's population on traditional fats. Like, for example, India, right? They have a lot of palm oil, right? Which is a high omega-6, right? And don't they have a problem with diabetes and have a problem with the COVID situation with severe cases of COVID right now? So could you switch them from palm oil to coconut oil in a sustainable way? I'm just thinking in a big picture sense.
There's sociological changes as well that you face, where we have tried to instill American diet in countries that are short of food. And if people don't know how to prepare the food and they don't like the taste of the food, it's a very, very hard transition. So Tata Foundation Mars Foundation and others are really working hard to try to figure out how do we feed an ever expanding human population without destroying the planet. And these aren't easy issues.
And
Really serious.
Ironically, it was again the Western countries that pushed these seed oils into all these different countries, right? And it was
the seed oils were introduced originally as a solution to the problem of not enough animal fats in the diet. It was the old guns versus butter trade-off, and from Economics 101, and the answer to that was cottonseed oil, and after that, Crisco. So this is, this came around because people thought they were doing something good, not because they were, trying to harm human health. I think it's important to recognize that.
I think also when your expected lifespan is 35 or 40, you look upon diet very, very differently when you're hungry than when you're hoping you can extend your lifespan from 70 to 90.
Yes, I was once asked by somebody, well, haven't rodents adapted to a high N6 PUFA diet? And I said, yes, they have. They have short lifespans.
Yeah, I saw that there's an epidemic in New York City for rodents getting diabetes, I guess, because of all the N6 junk food that they have in the
in the garbage.
So the rodents are getting diabetes. It's an epidemic. But that's the thing is that, and I wanted to make a point too. You guys mentioned the environmental impact, but from what I've understood, Tucker, and what was the gentleman's name that we talked about his report about how these vegetable oils are some of the most environmentally destructive things to produce for oil, right? Was it?
Oh, that was a fellow by the name of Jeff Nobbs, who, wrote, specifically soybean oil and palm oil, because of where they're grown, they wind up cutting down a lot of rainforests, and palm oil has put the orangutan population in jeopardy because they live in prime palm oil growing country. And, if you go in and mow down the forest to plant palm trees for palm oil, you're not doing the orangutans any favors.
Well, I want to circle back to our original premise as we kind of land the plane here, because we've covered a lot of topics and it's been a fascinating discussion. We've got so many more questions, but we want to be mindful for time here. But basically, we started off talking about the association with severe ARDS, which you mentioned, 40% of COVID patients that are dying are from this ARDS, right?
Almost half the people that die will die of acute respiratory distress syndrome.
And what are the others dying of in that number?
Other types of pneumonia, heart failure, blood clots. So there are a variety of other problems.
And it's important to note that the early examinations into the toxicity of leukotoxin, there's a dog study that was done where the toxin produced diffuse coagulopathy and produced heart damage. So those other features that, you may not die of ARDS, you may die of heart failure, but it may be the same pathway that's inducing that.
Wow. And the leukotoxins are not nearly as damaging to the heart as I would expect, but we do find elevated levels of leukotoxins in several different in patients with cardiovascular disease, as well as diabetes. So they're showing up as biological markers of lack of health from diabetes to heart disease.
Is that through, both of those diseases have inflammatory components, what they call sterile inflammation, where there's not an obvious infection agent at work, but the body's having essentially what seems to be an autoimmune reaction. So is that a marker of that process?
That's exactly what we think. So we're looking at it in heart failure, diabetes, and other indications. And Walter Sorfanger at Toronto is looking at this and is also finding in human patients a lot of association with dementia, among other things. So I think that we're seeing some really bad effects from what are wonderful chemical mediators at very low concentrations are very deleterious at high concentrations.
And I was
I
just
know there
seeing
was
a paper
was,
looking at it in its connection to schizophrenia too. That was interesting.
yeah, there was a paper that came out of, I think, Harvard a couple of years ago looking at 4-hydroxynonenal, which is another metabolite of linoleic acid in the body, being able to induce the amyloid plaque in an animal model, similar to what's actually happening in Alzheimer's disease.
Although there we have to be careful because the omega-3s peroxidize very quickly as well, and also produce these unsaturated aldehydes, which are basically tear gas.
Right.
Tear gas.
It's the same
Lovely.
chemistry.
So so just a few points. I remember one of the things Tucker Goodrich told me when he got off of the seed oils is he noticed he didn't burn as badly in the sun. Does that have some kind of relationship to that original research you were doing with burn patients and linoleic acid?
I'd like to think so, but probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a marked difference. I mean, I've used, you can both see me. I'm blonde, blue-eyed, and fair-skinned, and I used to roast in about 45 minutes. Now I can go 5 or 6 hours in the sun without getting a burn.
Yeah.
I'll get pink, but I'll turn tan the next day instead of peeling. So, and a lot of other people have reported the same thing after fixing their diet by reducing their omega-6 intake. A lot of the folks who go on a carnivore diet, if you're eating a lot of beef, of course, you're concomitantly reducing your omega-6 intake. So it's nice not to have to worry about that.
Products are very reactive.
Mm-hmm. And susceptible to UV damage, of course.
And Tucker, didn't you say something about the pathway that the government explored when they wanted to see radiation poisoning was a omega-6 related pathway? Was that right? When they were looking at how radiation poisons the body?
Yeah, there's some old studies from the 50s that demonstrate that what seems to be part of the toxic pathway of radiation damage is breaking down omega-6 fatty acids, which the oxidized products can be quite toxic. Again, as we've discussed, they're normal parts of the body's metabolism, but it's the dose making the poison.
Mm-hmm. These unsaturated aldehydes are very reactive, and we've evolved a system to get rid of them called glutathione and glutathione transferase. But when that's overwhelmed, they become very toxic very quickly.
Right. Glutathione, back to the targeted nutrition thing, one season, glutathione depends on intake of selenium. In one season, selenium deficient populations, specifically, there's been a lot of research done in China that they seem to have worse chronic disease outcomes because they're not able to detoxify these things as effectively.
So glutathione, in my days in Berkeley, when we got regularly tear gassed, students would use egg white and put it around their eye or soak handkerchiefs in egg white to eliminate the tear gas. And that's what our bodies are doing with glutathione, is that they are taking these reactive aldehydes, the alpha beta unsaturated aldehydes, and conjugating them with sulfur and eliminating them. So we're continually exposed to these materials. In fact, cinnamon is a highly reactive aldehyde. We like its taste in small amounts, but it's a very toxic component. But we've got glutathione to protect us, so all's well until we deplete that glutathione.
I guess that's what happens when you tear gas a hotbed of biological research, is people do things like soak their rags in egg whites because they know the chemistry of tear gas better than the police do.
I used to teach a toxicology class on how to make your own gas mask.
You used to teach it?
Yes.
That's excellent. That's very funny.
Professor German, I wanted to ask, based on this study that you both were involved with the COVID patients, does that indicate to folks at home that they could have a significant difference by just removing omega-6 consumption in terms of the seed oils and things? Or is that something that even if you remove them for months and months, if you've had them for years, they're going to bioaccumulate and still cause a severe case?
Yeah. Dietary effects rarely work acutely, especially in lipids. So it takes time to gradually deplete your body of these excessive reactive precursors. But it's just like any trip. Start now.
Right.
The longer the trip, the more the imperative to start early.
Right.
Actually, Craig Wheelock and others at Karolinska Institute are running an omega-3 trial with COVID, and I doubt that we could have somebody eat a lot of omega-3 or take omega-3 pills when they're already in the hospital. But I
it's just too late.
Yeah, I think that if we could anticipate somebody would be insulted and really increase their omega-3 levels and decrease their omega-6 levels a few weeks before, that we could potentially reduce this. Our bodies are really good at burning up vegetable oils.
Well, that's an important thing. That's an important thing to know and for people to hear, because there's quite a lot of concern amongst people who are trying to pursue a more personalized, healthy diet about how long it takes to clear out these fats and get back to a more evolutionarily appropriate fatty balance in the body.
But the work that's going on at Karolinska may actually help to say, from a practical standpoint, is it possible over a period of weeks to reduce the susceptibility to a terrible stress like COVID by shifting your lipids? In general, we are really quite good at eating an awful lot of junk food and surviving it. But when we run into terrible stress in addition, a car wreck or something, I think we can really get ourselves in trouble.
Yes, I came across one very interesting paper looking at ARDS incidents in trauma victims, and they found that putting the patients on a intralipid, which is a soybean oil infusion for nutrition, putting them on that infusion increased the rate of ARDS by 7-fold. And in a bit of very bad science, but very good medicine, over the course of the study, realizing how harmful it was, they reduced the soybean oil infusions and reduced the death rate from ARDS dramatically in that study. So that's closer to our hearts. Bruce's major professor and our dean at Davis, John Kinsella, had come up with that. And yes.
we started a study with him in looking at patients that were entering the ICU with things that we thought would lead to ARDS and sepsis. This was quite a number of years ago. And it was a disturbing study, because if the leukotoxins went up, the outcome was always bad in the patients. Always bad. And John noticed this association, and he had pushed the people at UCD with the total parental nutrition solutions, the TPN solutions, to eliminate the very high omega-6 levels in these solutions, both because they could go rancid on the shelf, and also with the idea that they could be resulting in leukotoxin. And sadly, John died, and the ICU doctor that we worked with both died of independent causes quite young. So we never really followed that up. But
fortunately, Kathleen Gura at Boston Children's Hospital has been doing a lot of research into replacing omega-6 infusions with omega-3 infusions to great success in treating children.
I'm just thrilled with that work. And it really follows what John had pioneered. He'd originally gotten upset with the Army putting high levels of linoleic acid in K rations. So K rations are what you give the guys that are going to jump in behind enemy lines who may die over the next 2 weeks. And why are you worried about the omega-6 levels in their diet when that omega-6 is going to go rancid? So
well, now that's I didn't know that, because of course the K rations were named after Ansel Keys, who was one of the early promoters of vegetable oils for heart disease. And Ansel Keys was a co-investigator of the Minnesota coronary experiment, which looked into reducing heart disease risk. And as one of the demonstrations, as we mentioned earlier, that vegetable oils lower your LDL, but in that study, they seem to also increase the death rate. So I guess he had a very valid concern over the long term for the problem of K rations. And now, of course, we're all on K rations thanks to Dr. Keys's work.
It is interesting how the best of intentions tend to go south sometime, but that John Kinsella was really driving that. I didn't even see rations that were canned before I was born, which was a bit of a shock to me, because the date of canning was on the bottom of the can. And the idea of preserving your heart by a mechanism that turned out to be wrong, by putting high linoleic in something that's going to sit on the shelf for 10 years before somebody eats it, John thought was really quite a bad idea. And it's nice that the work at Children's Hospital is correcting that.
Decades later.
You guys were mentioning the brown versus white fat and this issue. I was wondering, is there a connection to that in nature with torpor, with animals that they get into that lethargic hibernation state and they've got a lot more of the PUFAs, and are we in a chronic state of torpor in the human population because of the consumption of linoleic acid on a daily basis?
That's an interesting point. I don't know. Certainly the linoleic diols are involved in hibernation response and thermogenesis. So I bet you're actually on the right track, David. That's a good point.
Yeah, there's a woman, Susan Allport, who did a project on herself with Jeff Volek, who's gone on to work with Verta Health on treating diabetes through diet. And she was on a low omega-6 diet and increased it. And one of the things that she saw as a result of that was a lowering of her basal metabolic rate by 5% over a month. So that would certainly speak to that mechanism being a viable one in humans. Not something you'd want to do to yourself, of course, but.
Well, we've worked with a guy, Joan DeClaire in Madrid, and we found that the drug that we're working on reduces a lot of the comorbidities of diabetes that make.
This is the SEH inhibitor?
Yes, that make diabetes really so terrible. But in animals with diabetes, in some we can improve the diabetes itself, and others we can't. But what Joan did was to increase the omega-3. When he increased the omega-3 in the animals, the SEH inhibitors would actually eliminate the diabetes, cure it.
Wow.
Which we've never been able to see without that. So the SEH inhibitors actually work in several diseases quite well if they're given against a background of reduced omega-6 and increased omega-3. So that's not something you can actually get through the FDA, but it is, to me, really interesting from a social.
But you can do part of that yourself. You can alter your diet in that way, even if you can't get an SEH inhibitor now. I mean, that's certainly seems like it would have some independent benefit.
And DeClare's work, I think, is very strong in that with mice. So we can make healthy mice and maybe extend it even to healthy rats in New York, David.
I don't know if that's going to sell well in New York City. They don't want healthy rats.
Yeah, more robust rats are going to stick around a lot longer and pester people. Yeah. But I really appreciate your time. What was that?
I was just going to say, an additional concern is is mothers and babies.
Yes.
While we're talking about the exposure of adults, mothers are exposed to the same diets and through breast milk transfer this difference in omega-6 and omega-3. And that means babies for a couple of generations have been developing in those critical first 1,000 days on a background of an unusually rich supply of intense signaling systems. Not what you'd probably want to start your next generation.
Now, is that the case for mothers who are, even if they have cut a lot of their omega-6 seed oil consumption during the development stage of the baby in the womb?
Well, the interesting thing about mothers is they are filtering out an awful lot of the toxins from their diet and concentrating nutrients. But in terms of lipids,
in creating breast milk for the babies and in nourishing the babies when they're in the womb, they're trying to provide an optimal environment, which makes sense, of course, evolutionarily.
Right, but the lipids not so much. So if mothers eat a high omega-6 diet, their breast milk is high in omega-6, and so it's a especially important target for us to think about getting the diets of young mothers right.
Now, I've seen some papers suggesting that there are generational effects of a high omega-6 intake. Have you looked into that? Can you speak to that at all? Meaning that if you maintain a population on a high omega-6 intake, it has progressively worse effects on the offspring?
Well, and this speaks to the whole concept of early life imprinting programming, but this is a very old biological concept. Is every individual senses its environment early in life and adjusts its phenotype accordingly to the extent it can. So the most famous case is a marine crab. If the mother crab is in a particularly safe, nourishing environment, she lays her eggs and her baby crabs are born without shells. If she's in a hostile environment with predators, she lays the eggs and they have shells. So that concept of imprinting is in all of us. So if in early life we are exposed to toxicity, nutrient deprivation, caloric insufficiency, then we imprint that that's going to be our environment for life. And the Barker hypothesis basically has developed evidence to suggest if babies are undernourished early, then they tend to bias their fuel priority to storage throughout their life.
That's why babies are being born with obesity and diabetes in some cases. Yeah.
Right. And all of the implications of that. The same thing is true of immunity. The same thing is true of neurological development. That 1,000-day window affects all of us lifelong. But of course, we pass that on a little bit to the next generation and the next generation. And if it's been getting worse every generation, as the omega-6 had, you can predict what that's going to mean. So, unfortunately, we don't study mothers and babies much.
Well, what would you?
It's hard
I know
to,
you're probably not going to. I mean, what would you advise just your own personal self, not speaking as giving advice, medical advice, but what would you advise to pregnant and nursing mothers, knowing what you know? I mean, they don't know the data that you know, so what would you say to them?
Well, they should educate themselves as best they can, and there are paths to do that. But I mean, there are some pretty straightforward recommendations. Diversity. A range of foods will solve a lot of the problems. And the omega-6 is an unusual one because it's so insidious. You don't appreciate how much it's in all foods. But yeah, eat a diverse array of foods, lots of fruits and vegetables. They're all rich in omega-3, not omega-6.
If a young mother's, let's say a person's pregnant and they say, you know what, I'm not going to eat any omega-6 vegetable oils. I'm going to, cook things in coconut and ghee and butter, and I'm not going to eat out at restaurants and eat heavily, junk foods and stuff like that. will that make a big impact on how much of this omega-6 is turned on in the
Oh,
baby, or they're still
absolutely.
screwed if they've had it for decades before, you know?
No, the mother's diet is particularly important because, in essence, she's eating for two.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, she will have an impact, no question. And actually, as a society, we should be supporting mothers. We should be educating mothers. Us old dudes, we don't need the investment in our education. It's young, busy mothers that could really use the support.
Right, and there's a interesting paper looking at a hunter-gatherer tribe in the Amazon, the Tsimane, where they compared the breast milk of people eating a traditional diet to Americans, and it was much lower in linoleic acid, among other things, than you would see in an American woman's breast milk. So that, and this population, of course, doesn't get diabetes, and they, don't get heart disease and all these other things that we're concerned about, even though they're in a less than optimal environment. But
yeah, well, I really appreciate everything you guys have shared with us today. I think it's been very informative. I'm going to have to watch it over again, even though I participated in it, to make sure I learn as much as I can from this very informative discussion.
Well, I've learned a lot, David and Tucker. I very much appreciate your time. This has been fun.
Well,
it's been wonderful. Maybe next time we can add in a water balloon fight at the end of it. I understand that's an interest of yours too.
Yes, it is.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to let our audience know, a website or anything, a book or anything that for further reading or investigation about what you guys have been involved with in this topic?
I was just thinking that if somebody is interested in the science, Bill Lowndes really is the grand old man of this field. Some of his early work is somewhat dense, it's biochemistry, but his later writings, particularly as an advocate of, as he says, was it nix to 6 and eat to 3?
Right.
Is I think is pretty good advice, because we tend to add in omega-3, but not nix the omega-6.
And he put a website together I don't know if it's still operational, but last I looked, he had a website that helped people in figuring out how to do that through a food database.
And what was the name again?
It's Bill Lowndes. He published mostly under William Lowndes until he retired, and then he went by Bill Lowndes.
And Professor German, any final thoughts or recommendations for our audience for further research?
Yeah, think about mothers and babies. Thank them for their efforts, and nourish them better.
Very good. That's been a real pleasure. Thank you both, gentlemen.
A wonderful conversation. Thank you both. This has been so educational.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.